What are the odds of your wife cheating on you? Slim, right? Or not? Now, what are the odds of her cheating on you in a hotel just down the street from an old friend of yours? The kind of guy who recognizes her on sight. Practically impossible, you'd think. But let me tell you, I'm the exception to that rule. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. I wasn't just dealt a bad hand. I got the whole cursed deck, and the worst part? I didn't see it coming. Not even a hint. You think you know the person you share your life with, that you can trust them without question. But trust is a fragile thing. One wrong glance, one misplaced word, and it shatters like glass underfoot. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind to the night everything started to unravel. The night when a casual drink with an old acquaintance pulled the rug out from under my life. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that clings to the last warmth of fall before winter muscles in. I'd had one of those days, you know the kind, where your to-do list feels more like a cruel joke. Server issues at work, endless client calls, and a boss who thought urgent meant drop everything, even your sanity. So, when I finally logged off, I decided to decompress the old-fashioned way, with a cold beer and some bad bar food. I found myself at the Rusty Anchor, a dive bar near Lake Johnson that hadn't changed since my college days at NC State. Same peeling paint, same wobbly bar stools, and the same sticky floors that grabbed at your shoes like they had a vendetta. The place smelled like stale beer and fried grease, a comforting kind of grime, if you can believe it. I hadn't been there in years, but something about the neon sign flickering in the window pulled me in, like nostalgia wrapped in cheap liquor. I ordered a pint of local IPA and found a seat near the jukebox, half listening to a blues track that had been on repeat since the early 2000s. I wasn't looking for conversation, just some time to let my brain settle, maybe catch the tail end of the Hurricanes game playing on the dusty TV above the bar. That's when I heard it. Mark? Mark Evans? Is that you? I turned, and there he was, Chris Dalton. We'd gone to high school together back in Cary, though we hadn't been close. Chris was one of those guys who never quite left town, always had some wild story, and somehow managed to be in the right place at the wrong time. He hadn't changed much. Same scruffy beard, same mischievous grin. But life had added a few lines to his face, and his hair was losing the battle against gray. Chris, man. I stood up, shaking his hand. It's been, what, 15 years? At least, he laughed, clapping me on the back like we were old war buddies. You still around here? Yeah, living in Oakwood with my wife. You? South Hills, he said, sliding onto the stool next to me. Got a little place near Buck Jones Road. You should come by sometime. He signaled the bartender for another round. So, what brings you here tonight? Thought you'd be at some fancy wine bar by now. I chuckled. Needed a break from the home office. Figured I'd revisit some old haunts. We slipped into easy conversation, swapping stories about life since high school. Chris was in real estate now, married with 2 kids, and still drove that beat-up Ford F-150 he'd been obsessed with in senior year. We laughed about the dumb things we did in our teens, talked about mutual friends who'd either moved away or settled into the same old routines. Then, as the night wore on and the beers went down easier, Chris hit me with a question that would flip my world on its head. So, how's married life treating you? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Good, I said, not thinking much of it. Emma's got a busy job, but we make it work. She was out of town last weekend for some conference, so I had the house to myself. Chris paused, his beer halfway to his lips. Last weekend? No kidding. I nodded, oblivious to the trap I was about to step into. Yeah, she was in Greensboro for a marketing thing. Chris let out a short laugh, but there was something off about it. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's funny, he said, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was about to say. I could have sworn I saw you guys down in South Hills on Saturday. I frowned. South Hills? Yeah, near the Courtyard Marriott on Buck Jones Road. My wife and I were grabbing lunch at that little Italian place next door, La Piazza. Thought I saw Emma coming out of the hotel with some guy. I figured you were just having a little getaway or something. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd just said. Emma, at a hotel in South Hills? That couldn't be right. She was in Greensboro. She'd sent me pictures, texts about how boring the conference was, how she couldn't wait to get home. I forced a laugh, though it came out hollow. Nah, must have been someone else. Emma was definitely in Greensboro all weekend. Chris shrugged, clearly unaware of the bomb he just dropped into my life. Yeah, probably. Could have been a look-alike. My wife swears she sees her yoga instructor everywhere we go. But I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was spinning, replaying every conversation, every text, every detail from the weekend. The photos Emma had sent, the calls we'd had. They all seemed to fit, but now there was this seed of doubt growing in my chest, gnawing at the edges of my certainty. We wrapped up the night, exchanged numbers, and promised to catch up soon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I drove home in a daze, the familiar streets of Raleigh blurring past my windshield. When I got home, the house felt colder, emptier. I walked through the front door, past the photos on the wall, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, memories that now felt like lies carved in glass. I stood in the kitchen, staring at Emma's favorite mug on the counter, the one she'd had since college. It felt like a relic from another life. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through her text from the weekend. Everything seemed normal. Pictures from the conference, messages about boring seminars and bad hotel coffee. But now, with Chris's words echoing in my head, it all felt staged, like a carefully constructed alibi. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail over and over. Maybe Chris was mistaken. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. You know that feeling when your gut starts whispering that something isn't right? That whisper had turned into a scream in my head. After that night at the Rusty Anchor, after Chris's casual bombshell about seeing Emma near that hotel in South Hills, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every little thing felt like a clue, every detail suspicious. And the worst part? I didn't know if I was losing my mind, or if I was finally waking up to the truth. But here's the thing about suspicion. It's like an itch you can't scratch. It doesn't go away until you find the source. And I was about to dig until my fingers bled. The morning after that conversation with Chris, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee like it held the answers. Emma was bustling around, getting ready for work, humming some tune under her breath like it was just another day. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out the door, leaving behind the faint scent of her lavender perfume. But that kiss felt different now. It wasn't warmth I felt, it was doubt. I waited until I heard her car, a silver Honda CR-V, back out of the driveway and fade down the street. Then I grabbed my keys, slid into my truck, and followed. I wasn't sure what I was looking for at first. Maybe I hoped to catch her in a lie, or maybe I just needed proof that my paranoia was unfounded. But as I tailed her down the familiar streets of Raleigh, past the brick-lined roads of Oakwood and onto the freeway heading toward downtown, a cold realization settled in my chest. I wasn't going to find reassurance. I was hunting for the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Emma's office was in a sleek glass building off Fayetteville Street, one of those places with too many windows and not enough personality. I parked a block away and watched from a distance as she pulled into the underground garage. I waited for 15 minutes, heart pounding in my chest like I was pulling off some heist, but she didn't come back out. For the next 2 days, I followed her like a shadow. She went to work, grabbed lunch with coworkers at her usual spots, Beasley's Chicken Plus Honey, City, sometimes a quick coffee from morning times. Everything seemed normal, too normal. But normal doesn't mean honest. It was Friday when the cracks started to show. Emma had mentioned earlier in the week that she had a late meeting with clients and wouldn't be home until after 8. That alone wouldn't have raised any red flags. But after what Chris told me, every word out of her mouth felt like it needed to be dissected. So I followed. That evening, Emma left work at 5:30, much earlier than she claimed. I watched from the safety of my truck, parked discreetly across the street, as she navigated through the downtown traffic. But instead of heading home or to some client meeting, she took a sharp turn onto South Saunders Street, heading away from the bustling heart of Raleigh and toward the quieter outskirts. My heart was thudding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I should have. I stayed a few cars behind, far enough to avoid suspicion, but close enough to keep her in sight. She finally pulled into a small parking lot next to the Greenhouse Cafe, a cozy little spot near Dorothea Dix Park. Definitely not the kind of place you take clients for business meetings. I parked down the street, heart racing, and waited. 5 minutes later, she wasn't alone. A tall man in a navy blazer and dark jeans approached her car. I couldn't make out his face from where I was sitting, but I didn't need to. The way Emma's face lit up when she saw him told me everything I needed to know. She got out of the car, and they greeted each other like old lovers meeting after too much time apart. A hug that lingered too long, hands resting just a little too comfortably on each other's backs. They walked into the cafe together, laughing at something he said, and for the first time in my life, I felt the bottom drop out of my world. I sat there for a while, staring at the entrance like it might spit them back out any second. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think straight. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a friend's harmless mistake. This was real, and I needed proof. I waited for over an hour before they finally emerged. By then, the sky had darkened, casting long shadows across the street. They were walking close now, her hand brushing against his arm, his fingers grazing the small of her back. Every little gesture felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut. They didn't get into their cars. Instead, they strolled down the street, past the cafe, and into the parking lot of the Cambridge Inn, a low-profile hotel tucked away behind a row of trees. It wasn't fancy, but it was discreet, exactly the kind of place you'd go if you didn't want to be seen. I didn't follow them inside. I didn't need to. Watching them disappear through those doors was all the confirmation I required. But here's the thing. I didn't explode. I didn't storm in there, fists flying, demanding answers. That's not who I am. And besides, this wasn't the time for anger. No, I needed to be smarter than that. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about control. I drove home in silence, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me like a physical force. Every streetlight felt like an interrogation lamp, every stop sign a reminder of the life I thought I had. When I got home, I sat in the dark, staring at the walls we'd painted together, the photos of vacations and anniversaries that now felt like props in some elaborate play. The betrayal was undeniable, but I wasn't going to confront her, not yet, because this wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about preparing for what came next. And trust me, I was just getting started. The weekend passed in a haze. After watching Emma disappear into that hotel with the mystery man, I spent most of Saturday and Sunday cycling between disbelief and cold, calculated resolve. I didn't confront her when she got home. Instead, I acted like everything was normal. She strolled through the door late Saturday evening, claiming her client dinner had run longer than expected. She even tossed in a complaint about how boring it had been, how the clients wouldn't stop droning on about marketing strategies and quarterly goals. I nodded, smiled, and pretended like I wasn't picturing her laughing in someone else's arms. By Monday morning, I knew pretending wasn't enough. I needed proof, not just for my peace of mind, but for what came next. If I was going to walk away from this marriage, I wanted everything on my side. No arguments. No messy denials. Just cold, hard facts. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. It wasn't hard to find someone in Raleigh who specialized in cases like mine. A quick search online led me to Travis Holt Investigations, a small firm tucked away in a nondescript building off Hillsborough Street, not far from the NC State campus. Their website was simple but professional, and the testimonials were filled with people praising their discretion and thoroughness. That was exactly what I needed. I scheduled an appointment for Tuesday afternoon, telling Emma I had a client meeting downtown. She didn't question it. She rarely did these days. The office was on the second floor of a brick building sandwiched between a law firm and a coffee shop called the Morning Mug. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and stale coffee, the kind of scent that lingers in places that see too many people and not enough fresh air. I found Suite 204 easily enough, the door marked with a simple brass plaque that read Travis Holt, private investigator. I knocked once, and a voice from inside called, "Come in." Travis Holt was not what I expected. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his desk was a mess of files, coffee cups, and a half-eaten sandwich. But his handshake was firm, and his expression was all business. "Mark Evans?" he asked, motioning for me to sit. "That's me." He didn't waste time with small talk. "What can I help you with?" I explained everything. How I'd suspected Emma of cheating, how I'd followed her and seen her with another man, but hadn't confronted her yet. I told him about the hotel, the cafe, and even about Chris's accidental tip-off. Throughout it all, Holt just nodded, occasionally jotting down notes in a leather-bound notebook. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "Most people jump the gun, confront their spouse, and end up with nothing to show for it. But you've got a level head. That's going to help." "So, what's the next step?" "I'll tail her. Get photos, time-stamped records, whatever I can find. If she's meeting this guy regularly, it won't take long. You'll have what you need within a week, maybe less." It felt strange, handing over control like that, but I nodded. "How much do you need to get started?" Holt quoted a price that made me wince, but I didn't hesitate. I wrote the check, handed it over, and shook his hand once more before leaving the office. The next few days were torture. I went through the motions at work, staring blankly at my computer screen while my mind replayed every detail of the past few months. Emma's sudden work trips, her late nights, the distant way she spoke to me sometimes, like I was just a roommate instead of her husband. It all made sense now, but I still needed to see it, to hold the proof in my hands. Emma, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior, went about her life like nothing was wrong. She kissed me goodbye in the mornings, texted me updates about her day, and even suggested we plan a weekend getaway soon, just the two of us. The audacity of it made my blood boil, but I played along. I had to. On Friday morning, Holt called. "Got something you'll want to see," he said. "Come by the office when you can." I left work early, telling my boss I wasn't feeling well, and drove straight to Hillsborough Street. When I walked into Holt's office, he greeted me with a nod and handed me a thick manila folder. "It didn't take long," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Your wife's not exactly subtle." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. There were photos, dozens of them. Emma and the same man I'd seen outside the cafe, sitting together at different restaurants around Raleigh. The Greenhouse Cafe, the Raleigh Times Bar, even a park bench at Pullen Park where they shared a coffee and sat too close for comfort. But the most damning photos were the ones of them entering and leaving the Cambridge Inn. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in the past week alone. Each photo was time-stamped, detailing when they arrived and when they left. Holt had even included a log of Emma's daily activities, tracking her movements from the moment she left our house to when she returned home, pretending like nothing had happened. The man she was seeing wasn't a stranger either. Holt had identified him as Daniel Whitaker, a senior account manager at a competing marketing firm downtown. He was older than I expected, maybe early 40s, with a clean-cut look and a smug smile that made me want to punch something. "She's been seeing him for at least a few months," Holt said, tapping the log with his finger. "Probably longer, but this is all I could gather in the time you gave me." I stared at the photos, feeling a mix of anger and numbness settle over me. This was it, the undeniable proof I'd been waiting for. But instead of feeling relief, I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, had been living a double life right under my nose. I closed the folder and looked at Holt. "What do I owe you for the extra work?" He shook his head. "We're square. But if you need anything else, legal advice, help with next steps, I know people." I thanked him, took the folder, and left the office, my mind already racing ahead. When I got home that evening, Emma was in the kitchen, cooking dinner like it was just another Friday night. She greeted me with a smile, asked how my day was, and chatted about some new project at work. I nodded along, the folder with the photos tucked safely in my briefcase. As we sat down to eat, I watched her closely, memorizing every detail of her face, her mannerisms, the way she laughed at her own jokes. It felt surreal, like I was living in some twisted version of my life. But I didn't say a word. Not yet. Because now, With the evidence in my hands, it was time to plan my next move. And I was going to make sure Emma never saw it coming. Once I had the proof, there was no turning back. The photos from Travis Holt left no room for doubt. Emma wasn't just stepping out of our marriage. She had created a whole parallel life. Every smile she gave me now felt rehearsed. Every touch felt hollow. But I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Anger might have been my first instinct, but logic was my weapon now. I needed to be precise, methodical. If Emma wanted to play games, I was going to win. The first step was to find a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who could handle the kind of clean break I needed. Discreet, thorough, and ruthless if it came to that. I wasn't looking for a fight in court. I wanted to make sure when Emma found out, everything was already done. No room for negotiation. No room for her to retaliate. I started my search online, looking for the top-rated divorce attorneys in Raleigh. After reading through reviews and cross-referencing with a few discreet recommendations from colleagues who had been through messy divorces, I settled on Jordan Whitaker, no relation to Daniel, thankfully, a well-known family law attorney with a reputation for being sharp and effective. His office was located in a sleek building in North Hills, a far cry from the shabby little dive where I first heard Chris's offhand comment that unraveled my life. I scheduled the appointment under the pretense of a work meeting, and Emma didn't even blink when I told her I'd be home late. She was probably planning her next rendezvous with Daniel, and for once, that worked in my favor. Jordan's office was everything you'd expect from a high-end divorce lawyer. Minimalist decor, leather-bound books, and a wall of frame degrees from Duke and UNC Chapel Hill. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a professional, measured smile. We sat down in his glass-walled office, and I laid out the situation, starting with the growing suspicions, the private investigator, and finally, the stack of photos and time-stamped logs that left no room for argument. When I finished, Jordan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You've done a lot of the groundwork already," he said. "That's good. The more evidence you have, the smoother this will go. You mentioned the house is in your name only?" I nodded. "Bought it before we got married. Emma never asked to have her name added to the deed. That'll simplify things. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, but if the house is solely in your name and you've been paying the mortgage from your own income, it'll be hard for her to claim much of a stake in it, especially with her behavior documented." Jordan outlined the process for me step by step, filing the divorce papers discreetly, closing joint accounts, rerouting any shared financial obligations, and ensuring that Emma would be left with as little leverage as possible. He recommended a forensic accountant to double-check any hidden financial liabilities and gave me a list of actions to take immediately to protect my assets. I left his office with a plan and a sense of grim determination. The next few weeks would require careful timing and absolute secrecy. First, I tackled the bank accounts. Emma and I had a joint checking account at First Citizens Bank on Six Forks Road. We used it for household expenses, groceries, utilities, the occasional dinner out. But I also had a separate account, one I'd opened years ago for freelance IT consulting work. That account was solely in my name, and it would become my financial lifeline. I waited until Emma left for work the next day, then drove to the bank. The teller recognized me, Renee, a friendly woman with bright red glasses who always made small talk about the weather. I kept my face neutral, pretending this was just another mundane errand. "I'd like to close my joint account," I said, sliding the paperwork across the counter, "and transfer the remaining balance into my personal account." Renee hesitated, glancing at the screen. "Are you sure? This will remove both you and Mrs. Evans from the account." "That's correct," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We've decided to manage our finances separately from now on." It was a small lie, but it did the trick. Within minutes, the joint account was closed, and every cent was safely tucked away in my personal account. Next, I rerouted all direct deposits from my job at TechPoint Solutions. I logged into the company's payroll system and changed my deposit information to my personal account. Then I combed through our shared financial obligations, utilities, credit cards, even the automatic payments for Netflix and Spotify, and transferred everything into my name or canceled it outright. For the next 2 weeks, I continued the charade at home. Emma noticed none of it. She went about her routines, texting Daniel in secret while pretending to be the devoted wife. She'd hum to herself while cooking dinner, kiss me on the cheek before heading to her so-called late meetings, and even suggested we start planning for a summer vacation. The hypocrisy was suffocating, but I held my tongue. The final piece of the puzzle was the house. Our two-story home in Oakwood had been our pride and joy, or so I thought. We'd spent weekends renovating it, painting the walls, installing new fixtures, planting flowers in the front yard. It was where I thought we'd build a future. But now, it was just another asset to be managed. Since the house was in my name alone, I didn't need Emma's consent to sell it. I reached out to Carla Benson, a realtor I trusted from past dealings. Carla was efficient, discreet, and understood the need for confidentiality. We met at Jabala Coffee in Lafayette Village, a spot far enough from home that I wouldn't risk running into anyone I knew. I need to sell the house quickly and quietly, I told her over a cup of black coffee. I don't want my wife finding out until everything is finalized. Carla raised an eyebrow but nodded. I've handled sensitive cases before. I can make it happen. Within days, Carla had lined up a cash buyer, an older couple relocating from Charlotte who loved the charm of Oakwood's historic district. The offer was fair, and the process moved swiftly. I arranged for the closing to be scheduled right after Emma's upcoming work conference in Asheville, giving me the perfect window to finalize everything without her knowledge. By the time the end of the month rolled around, every financial tie Emma could exploit had been severed. The joint accounts were closed, the house was under contract, and my income was securely funneled into my private accounts. Even the smallest details, like removing her as a beneficiary on my life insurance policy and changing the passwords to all our shared streaming services, were handled. Through it all, I kept up the facade. I smiled when I needed to, laughed at her jokes, and even agreed when she suggested we have a date night to rekindle the spark. It was surreal, living alongside someone who had no idea that her world was about to collapse. But I had to stay focused. Every move I made was a step toward freedom, toward reclaiming the life I'd almost let slip away. And when the time came, Emma would realize just how thoroughly I had dismantled the life she thought she controlled. Emma's so-called work conference in Asheville was just around the corner, and I knew it wasn't business she'd be conducting there. Whether it was Daniel she'd be meeting or some other lie she had crafted, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that her absence gave me the perfect window to execute my plan without interference. The house sale had been moving like clockwork. Thanks to Carla's efficiency, everything was set to close during the 4 days Emma would be gone. The new owners, a couple from Charlotte named Brian and Denise Holloway, were eager to settle in. They had fallen in love with the house the moment they saw it. The hardwood floors, the wraparound porch, the little garden Emma and I had planted together in the spring. It was exactly what they wanted in their new home. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were about to start their new life in a house where mine had just fallen apart. The morning Emma left, I played the role of the supportive husband one last time. I helped load her suitcase into the back of her silver Honda CR-V, pretending not to notice the new overnight bag tucked beside it, the one I hadn't seen before, likely bought for this conference. "You sure you've got everything?" I asked, my voice steady. She smiled, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Yep. I'll call you tonight when I get settled." I nodded, returning her smile. "Have a safe trip." She waved as she backed out of the driveway, and just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear down the street. The second her car turned the corner, I went back inside and got to work. I had 4 days to erase myself from this house, and I wasn't about to waste a second. The first thing I did was grab the boxes I had hidden in the garage weeks ago, packed flat beneath an old tarp. I had been preparing for this moment, boxing up non-essentials when Emma was out of the house, moving slowly and carefully so she wouldn't notice anything missing. But now, it was time to finish the job. I started in the bedroom. I packed my clothes, toiletries, and personal items with mechanical precision. The framed photos on my nightstand, our wedding day in Charleston, the vacation to the Outer Banks, Christmas in Asheville, all of them went into a separate box. Not because I wanted to keep them, but because I wasn't going to leave them behind for Emma to stumble across later. In the office, I gathered my work equipment, laptop, external drives, and paperwork. The bookshelf was easy. Most of the books were mine, so they went into boxes, leaving the shelves half empty. I left a few behind, Ones Emma had bought or loved, but otherwise, I stripped the room bare. By the time I made it to the living room, the house was already starting to feel hollow. I packed up the few sentimental items I cared about, a handmade quilt from my grandmother, a set of antique tools from my father, and a framed map of Raleigh that had been in my family for years. The kitchen was next. I took the expensive knives I'd bought, the cast-iron skillet I'd seasoned to perfection, and the French press I used every morning. Everything else, the plates, the silverware, the wine glasses Emma loved, stayed behind. By the end of the second day, the house was almost unrecognizable. The closets were empty, the drawers bare. The only trace of me left was in the spaces where my things used to be. I rented a small storage unit on the outskirts of Raleigh, near Durham Road, where I stashed all boxes and furniture for her. The key to the unit would be left for Emma in due time, along with everything else she'd need to process what was about to happen. The third day was dedicated to cleaning. I vacuumed the carpets, wiped down the counters, and made sure the house was in perfect condition for the holidays. It was strange, scrubbing the floors of a house I'd once called home, knowing I'd never step foot inside it again. But it wasn't mine anymore, not in the ways that mattered. On the fourth day, everything was ready. The movers had come and gone, hauling away the last of my belongings. The house was silent, the kind of silence that echoes off empty walls. I stood in the middle of the living room, taking one final look around. The couch where Emma and I used to watch movies on Friday nights was gone. The dining table where we'd shared countless meals sat bare, the chairs neatly tucked in. The walls, once covered with photos and art, were now blank. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a shell. Before I walked out the door for the last time, I left an envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside were three things: the key to the storage unit where Emma's belongings were waiting, the divorce papers I'd filed through Jordan Whitaker's office, and a letter. The letter wasn't long. It didn't need to be. I had nothing left to say that could capture the betrayal, the anger, or the emptiness I felt. Instead, I kept it simple and direct, laying out the facts and making it clear that I wanted no further contact. I slipped the envelope under a paperweight, a small glass globe Emma had bought on a trip to Savannah, and walked out the door. I didn't look back. The Holloways were scheduled to move in later that afternoon. Carla had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring the handoff would be seamless. By the time Emma returned from her conference, the house would no longer be ours. I checked into a temporary apartment in Cary, a small, furnished space that was just enough for me to regroup and figure out my next steps. It wasn't much, just a bed, a couch, and a tiny kitchen, but it was mine, and that was enough. As I unpacked the essentials, my phone buzzed on the countertop. It was Emma, calling from Asheville. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off the phone, set it aside, and stepped out onto the apartment's small balcony. The sun was setting over the trees, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Emma would return to an empty house, and by the time she figured out what had happened, I would be long gone. The life we'd built together was over, and I was finally free. Emma's conference in Asheville was scheduled to end on Sunday afternoon, and I could picture her driving back to Raleigh along I-40, completely unaware of the empty house waiting for her. She would probably be tired from her trip, or whatever she had really been doing, and eager to slip back into the comfort of her double life. I imagined her rehearsing what she'd tell me, some carefully crafted story about exhausting meetings and networking dinners, with just enough detail to sound convincing. But the life she thought she was returning to no longer existed. While Emma was still on the road, I sat in my temporary apartment in Cary, sipping coffee from the chipped mug I'd brought with me. The apartment was small, tucked behind a row of townhouses off Tryon Road, but it was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, the silence felt like a relief instead of a burden. My phone sat on the counter, powered off. I wasn't interested in hearing whatever messages Emma had left during her trip. There was nothing left to say. By early evening, the Holloways would be settling into the house in Oakwood. I had given them all the details they needed about Emma's return. What time she'd likely arrive, what she drove, and what to say when she inevitably showed up, confused and furious. I wasn't worried about how they'd handle it. Denise Holloway had a way of being firm without seeming unkind, and Brian was the type of man who didn't tolerate drama. They understood the situation, and they agreed to do what needed to be done. I knew the exact moment Emma would pull into the driveway. I could almost hear the tires crunching on the gravel, see the way she'd pause for a second when something felt off. The lights in the house would be different. The porch, once familiar, now foreign. The tiny details would register first, the new welcome mat, the absence of her potted plants by the steps. And then, the shock would set in. But I wasn't there to see it. That was the whole point. Emma's drive from Asheville took about 4 hours, so by 6 p.m., she was pulling into what she still thought was her driveway. The sun would be setting behind her, casting long shadows over the street, and the neighborhood would be quiet except for the faint hum of cicadas in the trees. As she parked, she probably noticed right away that something was wrong. Maybe it was the car in the driveway, a blue Subaru Outback that didn't belong to us, or the strange feeling of disconnection, as if the house was pushing her away before she even reached the front door. I imagined her grabbing her phone, ready to call me, ready to ask why there were strangers in our house. But when she reached the porch, Denise Holloway would be there, waiting with the envelope in hand. The exchange was simple, clinical even. "Hi, can I help you?" Denise would have asked, her voice polite but firm. Emma, caught off guard, probably blinked in confusion. This is my house. Who are you?" Denise would have held out the envelope, her expression neutral. "I think you'll want to read this." Emma's eyes would flicker between Denise and the house, her brain struggling to process what was happening. But the truth was in her hands now, and there was no avoiding it. Inside the envelope were 3 things: the divorce papers, the key to the storage unit where her belongings were waiting, and my letter. It wasn't long, but every word carried the weight of everything I'd been holding back since the first crack appeared in our marriage. I'd spent days crafting it, not because I wasn't sure what to say, but because I wanted to say it right. I wanted Emma to feel every syllable, to sit with the truth without the chance to argue, deflect, or spin it into something it wasn't. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted closure. The letter. "Emma, by the time you read this, I'll be gone." I don't say that lightly or with any sense of triumph. This isn't about revenge or dramatic exits. This is about truth, about facing what we both know but have refused to admit. Our marriage is over. I'm sure you're confused right now, maybe angry. Maybe you're telling yourself there's been some mistake, some misunderstanding. But there isn't. There's no confusion, no accident. I know everything. I know about Daniel. I know about the hotel rooms, the secret meetings, the late-night excuses. I know you've been living a double life while pretending everything was fine at home. I didn't stumble upon this by chance. I followed the threads because something inside me, something I wish I'd ignored, told me things weren't right. It started with a simple conversation, one I'm sure you'd dismiss as harmless if you ever found out. But it led me to places I never thought I'd have to go. I hired a private investigator, Emma. I watched as he handed me photos of you and Daniel, sitting in cafes, laughing like I never existed. I saw the time-stamped records of you walking into hotels, holding his hand, like our vows meant nothing. And you know what the worst part is? It wasn't the betrayal itself. It wasn't even seeing the proof with my own eyes. It was realizing how easily you lied, how natural it seemed for you to come home, kiss me goodnight, and pretend like we were still the couple who built this life together. That's what broke me, Emma. Not just what you did, but how effortlessly you did it. I could have confronted you. I could have yelled, demanded answers, tried to salvage something from the wreckage. But I didn't want that. I don't want that. I realized there's nothing left to save. The woman I loved doesn't exist anymore. Maybe she never did. And that's the hardest truth of all. You'll find the divorce papers in this envelope. Everything is already in motion. The accounts are closed, the house is sold, and your belongings are in a storage unit off Durham Road. The key and the address are included. There's nothing left to discuss, nothing to divide. It's all been handled. I'm asking you not to contact me. This isn't an invitation for a conversation or a chance to explain. There's nothing you can say that will change what's already done. I'm choosing peace over chaos, clarity over confusion. I'm choosing to walk away. Goodbye, Emma. Mark. I didn't sign it with anything more than my name. No love, no regards, nothing that hinted at the life we once shared. Because by the time I wrote those final words, the life we had felt like a distant memory, something I could barely recognize. I knew the calm, deliberate tone would cut deeper than any argument ever could. Emma thrived on control, on having the upper hand in every situation. But this letter stripped that from her. There were no loopholes to exploit, no emotional outbursts to manipulate. Just the facts, laid bare in black and white. In the days that followed, I imagined her reading the letter over and over, searching for some crack in my resolve, some hint that this was a bluff. But there wasn't one. I'd made sure of that. Every detail, from the closed accounts to the sold house, was airtight. I'd left no room for negotiation, no opportunity for her to worm her way back into my life. The letter was my final word, and it was enough. While Emma grappled with the aftermath, I settled into my new life in Cary. It was strange at first, waking up in an unfamiliar apartment, surrounded by bare walls and the faint hum of traffic outside. But there was a freedom in the emptiness, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. I started filling my days with small routines, morning runs along Lake Johnson Trail, evening visits to Ashworth Drugs in downtown Cary for a cup of coffee at the old-school soda fountain. I reconnected with friends I drifted from during the years Emma and I had been together, people who welcomed me back without prying questions or judgment. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt like a gift. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. The worst had already happened, and I'd survived it. Emma tried to reach out in the days after she received the letter. I saw her calls, her texts, the desperate attempts to claw her way back into a conversation I'd already ended. But I never responded. I didn't block her number. I didn't need to. Ignoring her was enough of a statement. One evening, about a week after the letter was delivered, I received an email. The subject line was simple: "Please, just one chance to explain." I hovered over the message for a long time, my finger poised over the mouse. But I didn't open it. I deleted it without reading a single word. Because the truth was, I didn't need an explanation. I already had everything I needed. The letter wasn't just a goodbye to Emma. It was a goodbye to the life I thought I wanted. The house, the shared memories, the plans for the future. They were all built on a foundation that had crumbled long before I realized it. And while the betrayal cut deep, it also freed me from a life that wasn't mine anymore. In the end, the calm tone of the letter said it all. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was done. And that was the most powerful thing I could have written. When Emma returned to Raleigh and found strangers living in what she still believed was her home, I imagined the shock must have hit her like a freight train. The carefully curated life she had maintained, the one where she could balance a husband at home and a lover on the side, had crumbled in an instant. But that was just the beginning. After reading my letter and seeing the divorce papers, I knew the first thing Emma would do was seek legal counsel. She wasn't the type to sit back and accept defeat, especially when it came to something as significant as losing the house. She probably assumed there was some legal loophole, some detail I'd overlooked in my meticulous planning. But there wasn't. I had anticipated every move she would make. Emma contacted Richard Callahan, one of the more aggressive divorce attorneys in Raleigh. He was known for being a bulldog in court, someone who prided himself on getting his clients the upper hand, no matter the cost. But even the best attorney can't rewrite facts, and the facts were entirely on my side. The house in Oakwood had always been in my name. I purchased it years before Emma and I got married, using savings from my IT consulting business and a small inheritance from my grandfather. Emma had never contributed to the mortgage, and while we'd made improvements together, like renovating the kitchen and landscaping the backyard, those changes didn't entitle her to ownership. When she sat down in Callahan's office and explained her situation, I could almost hear the conversation in my head. "He sold the house without telling me," Emma would have said, her voice tight with frustration. "That can't be legal, right?" Callahan probably leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered her words. "Was your name on the deed?" Emma would have paused, the realization dawning. "No, but..." "Was your name on the mortgage?" Another pause. "No, but we were married. Doesn't that count for something?" Callahan would have sighed, his tone turning clinical. "North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, but if the property was purchased before the marriage and remained solely in his name, It's considered separate property. That means he had every legal right to sell it without your consent. I imagine the silence that followed, the way Emma's stomach must have dropped as the reality sank in. She hadn't just lost the house. She'd lost any claim to the life we'd built inside it. But that wasn't all. When Callahan asked about our joint finances, Emma would have confidently mentioned the accounts we shared at First Citizens Bank. She probably assumed there was still money tied up there, funds she could access to at least soften the blow of losing the house. But when Callahan's office contacted the bank, they discovered the accounts had been closed weeks earlier. Every dollar had been transferred to my personal account, leaving nothing behind for Emma to claim. Her credit cards, once tied to our shared financial ecosystem, had been disconnected. The utilities were no longer in her name. Even the small subscriptions, Netflix, Spotify, the meal delivery service she loved, had been canceled or moved entirely to my accounts. It wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a complete erasure. After realizing she had no legal ground to stand on, Emma's next move was inevitable. She called me. The first few calls came in rapid succession, one after the other, as if sheer persistence could force me to answer. When that didn't work, she left voicemails. The first was angry, her voice sharp and demanding. "Mark, what the hell is going on? You can't just disappear like this. Call me back." The second was more confused, laced with desperation. "I don't understand. Just call me, okay? We can talk about this." By the third message, the anger had given way to panic. "Please, Mark. I don't know what's happening. Just tell me where you are. We can fix this. I swear, we can fix this." But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Eventually, the calls slowed, but they didn't stop. I watched as her number appeared on my phone, again and again, until finally, I decided to answer. I was sitting on the small balcony of my apartment in Cary, overlooking the quiet street below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the trees, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. When I picked up the call, there was a brief pause on the other end, as if Emma couldn't believe I'd finally answered. "Mark." Her voice was soft, tentative. I didn't say anything at first, letting the silence stretch between us. "Mark, please," she continued. "I'm sorry. I don't know what to say, but I didn't mean for any of this to happen. We can talk, right? We can figure this out." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, then spoke. "You made your choice," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Now live with it." Before she could respond, I hung up. That was the last time I spoke to Emma. I didn't block her number. I didn't need to. The message was clear, and she knew it. The calls stopped after that, and the silence that followed felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. In the weeks that followed, I continued to build my new life. I found a permanent apartment in Morrisville, closer to work and far from the memories that haunted Raleigh. I spent my mornings running along Lake Crabtree, letting the rhythm of my footsteps drown out the remnants of the past. I reconnected with old friends, people who reminded me of who I was before Emma, before the lies and betrayal. I even picked up a new hobby, woodworking. It was something I'd always wanted to try but never found the time for. I started small, making simple furniture for my apartment, a coffee table, a bookshelf, but there was something deeply satisfying about creating something with my hands, something tangible and honest. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I never wondered what happened to Emma after that final call. Whether she stayed in Raleigh, moved somewhere new, or tried to rebuild her life with Daniel, it didn't matter. She was a chapter in my life that had ended, and I had no interest in reopening it. Every now and then, when I passed by a familiar place, the Greenhouse Cafe, Pullen Park, or even the old neighborhood in Oakwood, I felt a flicker of what we once had. But it was just that, a flicker, a distant memory of a life that no longer existed. And with each passing day, that memory faded a little more. This story didn't end with shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. There were no fiery arguments or last-minute reconciliations. Just quiet, methodical retribution. A clean break from a life built on lies. Emma made her choice, and I made mine. The rest was silence. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Mark's methodical approach to handling the betrayal was justified, or should he have confronted Emma directly? If you like this story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like.